anatomy and physiology of a lot of different plants and animals, you start finding that many of them share common features. For instance, the two bones that make up your forearm are called the radius and the ulna. The radius and ulna allow your arm to rotate around a central axis like this. We have a radius and ulna in our forelimbs, but so do a lot of other animals. Rodents do. Bats and birds both do in their wings. Cats and dogs. Even whales and dolphins have them in their flipper. The theory states that we share this common feature because we, meaning all birds and mammals, have a common ancestor that also had that feature. When I see common design, I see evidence for a common designer. However, if you decide to use homologous features as evidence for evolution, you have to know that your ability to interpret these features as homologous features requires you to first accept evolutionary theory as fact before you look at the evidence. Once again, you have to use evolution as evidence for evolution. Consider the concept of convergent evolution. Convergent evolution is when two different species evolve to have a similar feature, when they don't share a common ancestor that had that feature. So, convergent evolution has two species evolving the feature instead of gaining it from a common ancestor that already had it. For example, bats and dolphins both have a very similar radar system, but nobody believes that bats and dolphins evolved from a common ancestor that also had that radar system. Therefore, the radar in bats and dolphins is an example of convergent evolution. But this means that that common feature in bats and dolphins is not a homologous feature. And how do we know that bats and dolphins are not descended from a common ancestor that has that radar? Well, because we already have an accepted phylogenetic tree that tells us what the common ancestor of bats and dolphins was. And that ancestor did not have the radar. The radar came later. So to tell homologous features from convergent evolution, we have to look at the evolutionary ancestry of the species in question. But that means that homologous features cannot be used as evidence for evolution. We need an established evolutionary story before we can even tell if a common feature is homologous or not. But if we need a common evolutionary story to be established before we can even decide if a similar feature is homologous, then we can't say that the existence of those homologous features is evidence for the evolution, can we? Common features are homologous if the evolutionary tree tells us that the common ancestor of the two species in question had that feature. And then we take the existence of the homologous features and use it as evidence for the evolution that has to be assumed before you can decide if the features are homologous or not. Imagine using this kind of logic in debating the guilt of a murder suspect.
Look, at the scene of the murder, we found footprints.
But does that prove the defendant to be guilty? Only if we know that those are his footprints.
We know the defendant is guilty, so those must be his footprints.
But how do we know the defendant is guilty?
We know he's guilty because we found his footprints at the scene of the crime.
Back to the chart. If all of these similarities are not because of common ancestry, then what do all these animals need a radius and ulna for? Very simply, hands, wings, feet, and flippers all need to be able to do this. It's a smart design that works. So these homologous features actually show a common designer using similar designs to give the same function to different kinds of animals. Just like we saw with the fossil record, using homologous features as evidence for evolution requires you to first accept evolution just by faith, and then examine the evidence in light of that faith before you can use it as evidence for evolution. Once again, evolution has to be used as evidence for evolution. As for me, I'd rather take God at his word when he says he created everything. It makes far more probable sense to believe that all of the brilliant design we see came from a brilliant, intelligent designer. As always, thanks for watching. This chapter, and now all of the chapters on the Defining Evolution series, are up on our new website, abitoforange.com, so check that out. Thanks for liking, sharing, and subscribing, and happy nachos.